Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute. For those of you joining us for the first time, we're an independent charity established in 1985 to increase diversity of thought on issues related to the economy and public policy in Scotland. A link to our website is in the Zoom chat if you'd like to find out more about our work. And just before we get started, a few things about how it will run today. We're recording the session and it will be uploaded to our website afterwards. As I welcome everyone, please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and connect with others, for example, through sharing a link to your LinkedIn profile. The event discussion will start with about 35 minutes of conversation between Melissa and Avik before we move into questions from the audience. For the questions, please post them in the Q&A section and we'll invite you to unmute and ask your question directly. And when asking your question, if you feel able, please state your name and, if applicable, your organisation. And if you're able to unmute, please just put that in the text of your questions. That makes it easier for us. And as we near the end of the event, we may group the questions to try to get through as many as possible. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to our host for the conversation today, Melissa Benn. Melissa has written in the national press for several decades on political and social topics, particularly on equality in education. She's published 9 books, 4 of them on education, including School Wars, The Battle for Britain's Education. In terms of campaigning, Melissa was awarded the Fred and Anne Jarvis Award in 2012 for her outstanding advocacy for greater equality in education. And from 2014 to 2018, she was chair of the campaign group Comprehensive Future, which and is the founder member of the Private Education Policy Forum. In 2019, she was appointed a member of the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, which reported in 2020. So over to you, Melissa, for our discussion today. Is too much choice a bad thing? Comparing the experience of parental choice in English and Scottish education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm really enjoying the idea that I might have been the chair of something called Conservative Future. My thoughts might have got a wider audience if I had been, but it is Comprehensive Future. So look, I'm really delighted to be talking to Avik today, and I'm going to introduce him before we talk about his fascinating doctorate, which has had, for a doctorate, a lot of exposure in the press, and that's because it is a very important topic. So Avik, before we start, let me describe your impressive achievements so far. Aveek Bhattacharya is your chief economist at the Social Market Foundation, which is a cross-party think tank based in Westminster. And Avik works on a wide range of policy areas, including economic policy, justice, public health, but first and foremost education. Prior to that, he completed a PhD in social policy at the LSE, London School of Economics, my old university, which is the subject of our discussion today. Having grown up in Scotland but studied and worked in England, he has a particular interest in comparing policies in the different countries. Avik has also worked for the Institute of Alcohol Studies, an organisation that seeks to reduce alcohol harm, and in private sector strategy consultancy. He is co-editor of a recent book, Political Philosophy in a Pandemic, a collection of essays exploring the moral and political implications of COVID-19 for our societies. Welcome, Avik.
Thanks, Melissa. Lovely to speak to you today.
So I thought we'd start, as this is going to be a discussion about choosers and non-choosers and how that takes place in the broader political context. I thought we might each just say a bit about our own background in terms of being choosers and not choosers in an educational context. So do you want to start and tell us just a couple of lines about you in that regard?
Yeah, so my educational background maybe might be a bit useful here, because I grew up in Scotland. I grew up in Aberdeen. I went to my local state school, but I would say also that my parents, a couple of years before I started secondary school, moved out to the suburbs to a slightly more affluent area. So there was probably some dimension of choice, and we can come into this a bit more. A lot of kind of informal choice in the education system. The educational choice is wrapped up with other things that happen. You reach a certain life stage, you want to move to a certain area, and school is one of a number of considerations that is wrapped into that. but there was no kind of formal school choice as such. It was still the kind of neighbourhood school that I went to.
Right, and you're this is a sort of typical pandemic situation, but you come from Scotland, you live in York, but you work in London.
That's correct, yes.
That's right. Okay, so that makes me very parochial, which I am. I come from London, I live in London, and I work in London. But I think I'm a good example of a group you don't talk that much about in your study, which is active non-choosers, and maybe we'll come on to that. But I grew up in a fairly affluent area, went to my parents believed in comprehensive education, sent to a pioneer comprehensive, which was genuinely a genuine social mix, because most of the affluent people in that area were going elsewhere. And then when I became a parent myself, the local secondary school was one that was, I think fair to say, not the school of choice for, as it were, the middle class parents in the mixed area I live in, which is Brent. And I and a group of other parents, I suppose, not campaigned, but decided we would send our children to the local school and that we would do our best to support it. And I think it's fair to say that for lots of reasons, the school grew in confidence and attainment and achievement. And the second thing to say is that I, as a parent, saw how school choice at a secondary level was absolutely crucial to the way the system worked. And that, broadly speaking, choice at the time I was doing it, which was 15 years ago for my children, benefited the more advantaged, because there was more choice for those who could pay or get tutoring, or, as you say, you indicate, people who can live in a certain area. They might not choose to live in that area because of schools, but you know, the two things go together. So I was really interested in your doctorate, and perhaps you could start by saying why did you decide to pick on this subject of school choice?
So it came actually a bit at an angle, a bit from left field. So I was very interested in behavioral economics and a lot of the work that was going on looking at insights from social psychology and how they might be applied to different areas of public policy. And there is this huge kind of discussion in that field about the negative aspects of choice, about the stress and anxiety, the paradox of choice or choice overload, these terms you might have come across in the headlines. And they were kind of raising a bit of a storm within those fields. But this was happening at a time when a lot of public policy had drifted towards kind of a great focus on choice and empowerment, and that being a way to both improve public services and to kind of make things better for users of public services, probably kind of most volubly under the Tony Blair government. And so I saw this kind of discrepancy between this academic movement calling to question the value of choice and a political kind of movement that was very much valorizing choice, and wanted to see how they fit together. Do these critics have anything to say to these kind of advocates, and can we try and bring them together? And so schools was an example of an area of public services. But it could have been medicine, it could have been social care. There are different areas I could have gone for, but it was education that I was really kind of keen to focus on, almost as a case study of what might be a broader phenomenon.
Yeah, and of course, the other really interesting contrast, not just between the academic findings and political passions around choice, is that you looked at the English and Scottish systems, which I think many people wouldn't realise are so different in this regard. So I wonder if you could just, for those who haven't read your doctorate, as I have, or even the articles about it, outline how the two systems work in brief.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to say it is that the default in Scotland is not to choose, and the default in England is you're expected to choose. So in Scotland, you are allocated a school by your local authority. You get a letter saying, in August, you'll be going to this school. If you don't want to go to that school, write to us and let us know. And you can make an application, what is called a placing request, to one, maybe two or three other schools, if you would like to go somewhere else. And in practice, 13% of children make a placing request. About 80% of those are granted. So that's the situation in Scotland. So 90% odd are going to the school that is their kind of neighbourhood catchment school. In England, the assumption is that you will choose, you're expected to fill out an application form which listing between 3 and 6 schools in rank order. Even if you don't want to choose, you will just have to put as your first choice your local school and explicitly kind of state that in so many terms. In practice, 60% of families in England don't opt for their local school as their first choice, although they might not get their first choice. And it turns out about 50% of English kind of kids end up going to their nearest school. Sorry, this is all for secondary school. It's a little bit different for primary school, but the process is fundamentally the same.
Right, and something that occurs to me now, and I don't think you do touch on it in the thesis. You say the 13% choose a placing in Scotland. Is that figure stay steady over the years, or has it changed, increased, or?
It has basically been steady, yes. There's not a lot of data, so I had to go out and collect my own data. The Scottish government stopped publishing on this around about 2009. So I went and made a bunch of freedom of information requests to councils, collated that up. But the answer came out the same in the past decade. It's gone from 14% to 13%, so slightly down, but I don't know if that's
right. So it's pretty steady,
it's basically the same,
as you can tell. And one of the themes that comes out throughout your work, and that clearly strikes me, is the very different cultures around choice in Scotland and in England. So I, again, as a parent and a citizen and somebody very interested in these things, has observed how, well, you say from the Blair era onward, but actually we can go back to open enrolment under Kenneth Baker, the Thatcher period, the beginning of bringing in ideas of the market under the guise of fairness and opportunity, and we'll come back to that as an argument, into school choice. And that has been a really powerful part of the English landscape. And I know less about the Scottish landscape, so perhaps you could tell me the equivalent assumptions around school choice in that period in Scotland.
So it's very interesting. If you want to dig way back into the history, the origins of school choice are both in the Thatcher government, the 1980 Education Reform Act in Scotland and 1981 in England. And actually the 1980 Reform Act, which introduced a system of placing requests into Scotland, went a little bit further than what they had in England, in part because the Westminster government didn't trust Scottish councils to kind of push choice and promote it, and they felt they had to tie their hands a bit more. But basically that system, which was introduced under the Thatcher government in the 1980s, has been left essentially untouched for 40 years. So the level of the amount of choice that we have in Scotland is basically a legacy of that. Right.
So what stopped Scotland going down the English route? That's really, I mean, is it a deep cultural and political difference, or is it about the politicians that have been in Scotland in the last 30 years?
I mean, I think this is a really interesting question about how deep these political differences go. It is clearly the case that at Holyrood, and this is true of the Welsh Assembly as well, there is a different ethos, there's a different kind of attitude to public services, there is a greater skepticism and marketisation. And as I touched on, this isn't just about the education system. So, I mean, this is schools, it's there in relation to tuition fees for universities, it's there in relation to the way that the NHS works. So there is this kind of ideological strand of policy making in Scotland, which has gone in a different direction to England, and they split apart certainly after devolution, if not perhaps even earlier. So that's what explains it kind of at a political level. How far that reflects different attitudes and public opinion, that's a really complicated question. I don't know if I can.
Well, I mean, you do say at points that the two must be reinforcing each other.
Absolutely.
The more you have a strong local state and not a great emphasis on choice, the more parents are led to trust that as a system. I mean, I guess not explicitly, but that seems to be the case. Whereas here, the more you have the political classes of all parties, because I think the Blair government is very important here, saying choice is a good thing and choice is about fairness, the more people come to accept that it's both about opportunity and fairness. And that's my final sort of contextual question before we get on to your findings is, you're looking at what we would call what you call the intrinsic value of choice, which in layperson's language is how it makes people feel. But of course, is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So it's does it make us feel good or not? But what's the evidence, very briefly, on the empirical evidence on whether choice in the English system, because it's not so strong in the Scottish system, has led to greater attainment, greater fairness, and less segregation?
Actually, I mean, we don't just need to limit ourselves to England. I think it's more compelling to look at this in the international evidence. So there's been now decades of experimentation with various forms of choice reforms in different countries, in Sweden, in Netherlands, and all over the place. And the evidence is basically that it's had minimal impact. Some studies find a slight positive impact on attainment. Some studies find basically null. But it's whichever way you cut it, the effect has not been anywhere proportionate to the size of the impact that policymakers wanted. So the best you could say for it is maybe it has improved educational outcomes very slightly. Now, against that, what we do know is that it has definitely worsened segregation and increased inequality within the system. And this seems to be consistent everywhere we look, where you kind of empower parents, or you encourage parents to choose. What they do is they self-segregate and they move away from each other. Yeah. And so that's
and I think that was what I was trying to say at the beginning about my own experience. That was how I perceived choice working. It meant that the better off and the better informed, which are often connected, could, as it were, get away from the local school, which, as you say, under our current system, 60% of people don't put that as their first choice. So these things are all mutually reinforcing. So what's so interesting about that, the clear empirical evidence internationally and nationally, is that what politicians might say, and there may be a politician on this call, is, okay, it may not have had the effect we hope, but parents want it and parents like it. And this is where we come to your study, because you show that actually it's just a little bit more complicated than that. So what do you find about how parents feel about choice in the two systems?
So look, it is absolutely the case that parents say they want choice. Yeah. And that is not, for all the political differences between England and Scotland, that's not actually different between the two countries. Scottish parents are just about as likely to say that they want to have a choice of schools as English parents. The big difference is that Scottish parents are, are generally happy with the level of choice that they have. They're no less satisfied. And in fact, English parents are more likely to kind of feel frustrated by the system. So having the ability to rubber stamp your local school or opt out if you don't want to through the place request system kind of satisfies that need adequately for the vast majority. But what you don't get in the Scottish system to anything like the same extent is the stress and the anxiety and the uncertainty and the time and the pressure that goes into the English system. It is just a lot more involved and fraught. And I think it might be worth, because I suspect that a lot of people in this call might be from Scotland, might not be so familiar with the English system. It is analogous to, for example, the way university applications work, in terms of you'll have open days and you'll be taking days off work and taking your kids out and going to see them. You'll be poring over league tables. You will be you'll be going on Mumsnet forums and reading thread after thread. Certainly not everyone, I should say. This experience will vary, but to a greater or lesser extent, it is just a much more involved process that comes with a lot of mental angst and social pressure.
Yeah, I mean, just to chuck in my own experience again, I can remember being at toddlers' tea parties and parents quite seriously, well, mothers quite seriously comparing league tables. Although, of course, what's so interesting, and you touched on this, is that schools change. So you might think a school was the good school to go to when your child was 2. By the time they're 11, that's nearly a decade. And there is something inherently unstable, particularly in the current era, and I mean the last decade or so, about public services. So, I mean, you know, it's, if you think you're getting in early, you in fact could be not finding out the right information. Now, you're a very fair-minded, it's a very fair-minded study, and you do talk about elements of enjoyment. You say some English parents find it enjoyable, but then you're that doesn't seem to go that far. Do you want to explore that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so the things that they enjoyed by and large were the experiential kind of elements of choosing. So open days are, they're a display, there's something, I think, call it carnivalesque is maybe stretching it a bit, but there's a bit of that, and it gets kind of, it builds up the excitement of the process. It makes it feel more tangible and real. There's a bit more of a show. It makes you feel kind of a bit wanted. So that element was a thing that people tend to enjoy, and the process of going through that and being involved with your children, I think it was enjoyable with some of the parents that I spoke to. I mean, I would say that I don't know if that is essential or inherent to choice. There's maybe a question about whether, and this is a broader question that extends beyond starting school to further down the road, whether choosing engages you a bit more with the process, engages parents and families more with the education system. But I don't think it needs to be. And I could certainly imagine a situation where a Scottish school where the vast majority of the children are from the local area could be holding those sorts of events, kind of building up those relationships, starting early. And in some ways, there's an advantage there because you can start much, much sooner, knowing that most of the children, because you know well in advance most of the children that will be going to your school rather than having to wait until.
But what you mean there is that there could be better transition processes.
Absolutely.
That's some mix between transition and choice, which is slightly different from saying, I'm going to go for you. Because actually my experience of secondary schools, they've got very good at transition, but that's after they know who their intake are. Now, you know, there's elements of a novel in your PhD because you quote people. It's very, and there's a lot about the stress, but you talk about parents weighing information. But I wondered if you got any sense maybe from sitting with parents about what was the information that really mattered to them. I mean, my perception as a parent was that social mix was very important to parents. You don't bring that out that much. You suggest that they're all rather, you know, interested in facts and achievement and Ofsted reports. Do you think that social mix was important? Was that under the radar a bit?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think probably the reason I maybe played it down a bit, relatively speaking, is because a lot of the kind of previous scholarship, that's been the tenor of it. And there's a sociological kind of program of research, particularly kind of through the late 90s into the early 2000s, which was all of this it's looking at everything through a social class lens, looking at everything in terms of this is a way of reinforcing your middle classdom or othering the working classes. And I'm not saying this dismissively, I'm saying this is because I was trying to get away from that and look at some different aspects. So I think that is definitely, that definitely was there. I think the first thing to say that is absolutely kind of clear is, for all that I'm talking about Ofsted reports and league tables, the things that probably move people the most are still the look and feel of the school. You go there, does it seem like the sort of place you could see your children? And behind that, there are probably myriad social biases, because a lot of, would my child fit in here? Is this the sort of place I feel comfortable? Yeah. Is looking around, what do the other parents look like? What do their children look like? What are my friends and my peers doing? Is this kind of, does this feel like a crazy decision? So, I mean, part of the research was done, part of the way that I accessed parents and kind of recruited people to speak to me was through an organization called Meet the Parents.
Yes, I know that organization, yeah.
Which operates in Camden. And a large part of what they try to do is they try to get parents together and destigmatize going to your local school, and to make people feel reassured that other parents like them are making similar decisions. And so it's not so risky. So that sort of social pressure is really powerful.
Yeah, and sort of making decisions feel a bit safer. I mean, because it's a very individual process, isn't it? I mean, just a quick question. It's parents largely doing the choosing, not the children.
It varies. It actually does vary. And this is, again, previous research has shown this is a dimension of class distinction as well. So middle class parents are far more likely to choose a school directly, or in various ways to try and condition kind of the child's choice. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, working class parents are much more likely to basically delegate the decision to the child.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of complexity here in terms of whether it's framed as a child's decision, to what extent the child is consulted, to what extent the child is kind of dictated to. Yes, so I think a lot of the discussion, the term that is used is parental choice, but that is an oversimplification, absolutely.
Yeah, and what I'm noticing as we're talking is that, in a way, a lot of my questions are around the system that you find to work less well than that, which is the English system, than the Scottish system, which works well. It's a bit like, you know, one always focuses on problems rather than what the Scottish system is simpler.
Yes.
But I do have one more question about the English system before I come to one that applies to both, which is, I've done a lot of campaigning over the years in England on admissions policies, and particularly the 11 plus, which is obviously a very clear way of deciding who, and in a way the school chooses, but there are all sorts of ways that schools choose. Faith schools, I think faith actually is quite well, there's aptitude, there's partial academic selection. Now, I know that wasn't the subject of your study, but did you get the sense that parents knew that in a way they were being chosen as much as they were doing the choosing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things there. I mean, the first thing is that even if we had a very simple admissions process, which was just on distance, say, or just on whatever, even where it's relatively straightforward, there still is a sense that because certain schools are oversubscribed, because your chance of getting your favorite school, I think, is now down somewhere below 80%, getting the chance of getting your first choice school in England. There was a sense of, this isn't just about me. So the number of people who told me that it's all an illusion, or it's all just impression management, you don't really get a choice, there was a lot of disenchantment in England, and that kind of jarred quite strongly with the rhetoric of empowerment in England. So that was one dimension. On your point specifically about admissions procedures, that complexity makes things so much worse, and that will vary in different places. So I think the fieldwork in London, where you've got such a diverse array of schools, where you've got some that are academically selective, some that are selective on other criteria. So, for example, you might need to do a recital of a playing instrument because it's a music kind of type school. There's faith schools, which is there's this big kind of phenomenon of people having to demonstrate their faith of going to the church kind of for the couple of years before they apply to the school to kind of prove their bona fides. There's something called banding, which will take me a little while to explain, but it is essentially an effort for the school to try and ensure that the makeup of its intake is reflective of the local area of different abilities. But that is quite complicated to try and navigate from the family side.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, there are. I mean, can I just point people who are interested to two publications that Comprehensive Future brought out, one on fair admissions, which looks at how, for example, something like banding that sounds so fair can be done in a way that skews the school towards applicants from better informed, more ambitious families. You know, you set the banding test on at a time when it's not so easy for children who may come from certain backgrounds to go, and so on. So it really is quite a complicated matter. Now, mothers, it seems, again, my perception is that mothers carry the load on this. Now, I know this is outside your academic field, but you know, you mentioned social psychology. Do you agree with me? And any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So again, there was a fair amount of work done on this kind of in the 90s, which was very much kind of emphasizing that it's mothers who carry the burden. And that's largely true, but it was striking in my interviews. It did seem kind of qualitatively different from from this, what the situation was 20 years ago. And this frankly isn't that surprising if you look at how parenthood has changed, if you look at how gender roles have moved forwards in some ways. So it still will be mothers who do the bulk of the legwork, who go to the open days, who probably do more of the kind of sifting through the information. But I suspect maybe 20, 30 years ago, you'd be more likely to speak to a dad who's just like, I don't know what's going on. Something is happening, but someone else is sorting it. And now the dads are at least aware of what's going on, can give you an account of what's happening. And many of them will feel it just as much as the mothers. But yeah, it varies from family to family. I think it's moved in that direction, but we're nowhere near parity as on.
So if I could use a rather crude analogy, 20 years ago, a lot of the dads wouldn't have been in the car of choice. Now there are a lot of them in the back seat, but not backseat driving, and a few are the parents are driving together. So I take that point, and that's actually that's really interesting. Now I think perhaps one of the things we haven't done, because it's so obvious, is to repeat your main conclusion from the study, which is, if you can elaborate, but that a system that has less choice, Scotland, provides greater satisfaction for parents than a system that has far more. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. I think, yeah, that's the. Do
you want to tell us a bit more about that, statistically? And
sure. I mean, so the upshot is basically, if you, as I said, if you ask parents whether they want choice or not, parents in England, Scotland both say they want choice. If you ask parents if they're satisfied with the level of choice they have, it's around about the same. If you speak to them, as I did, if you interview them, the qualitative results suggest that English parents are more likely to express frustration and disappointment, and to say things like it's all an illusion, it doesn't really work. And then if you probe levels of stress, anxiety, the amount to which they feel it's time consuming and pressurized, on all of those domains, English parents do worse than Scottish parents. Yes, so.
But to be fair, we have to say that the 13% that apply for a placing outside may be more similar to English parents.
That's basically true. Yes. So parents who make placing requests look more English than your typical Scottish parent, and in some regards they look pretty similar, in other regards they're somewhere in between. But that's the upshot. Yes. Yeah,
and are they more middle class? Is that fair?
It was so you asked it when we were speaking about this before. You asked this, and I had a little look. It's really hard to tell. So part of the thing is that, because as we've been talking, we haven't been talking about Scotland very much, and it really hasn't been a particularly big program of research. There isn't a lot of data. As I said, the Scottish government stopped publishing kind of aggregated data on placement requests back in 2009. So I have a relatively small kind of survey that was the basis of my PhD research. Looking at that, there does not look to be a kind of clear class difference between parents who make placement requests and parents who don't. The one thing that is clear, but is also maybe unsurprising, is there is an urban-rural divide. So placement requests will be higher in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen than they are in other parts of the country. That's not surprising, but it's hard to say anything with any kind of certainty around the class thing. One thing we can say, a data point that we do have in England, is we can link kind of engagement with choice. Are parents more likely to use their full set of choices? Are they more likely to apply to a school that isn't their local school? And for a long time, the narrative was that it's middle class parents who engage kind of deeply with choice and working class parents who don't. And certainly in terms of actually putting down applications, in terms of not applying to your local school, that doesn't hold in England either. So maybe it's not surprising that there doesn't seem to be that big of a class difference. Although the ways in which people engage with choice and the issues that they have, I think, will be different by class. That is true.
You do mention that the two groups in the English system that get particularly exercised about it are foreign-born migrant families and undergraduates, and that both makes sense in terms of, to use traditional, maybe cliched narratives, really wishing for greater opportunity, and on the other side with undergraduates having more of a sense of the sort of social nuance and long-term meaning of going to a particular school. So that does make sense. Now I think we should, we have just a couple more things. Let me put a question to you that, if I had ever been the chair of something called Conservative Future, would be a good question, which is, would some people argue that the Scottish citizens are happy with less high standards, that they accept adequacy, they're not looking for the best, and that the system supports that? I mean, it's a slightly unfair, you're not a politician, but people must have put that to you, and that England is facilitating greater striving and higher standards, even though we know it hasn't led to much higher standards.
At the individual level, I don't think that's true, actually. And I think people take their cues a lot from the system that they're in, from the politicians. So I think if you're in a situation where you're expected to go to schools and rank them, that kind of encourages that frame of mind. I think that certainly I expect a lot of Scottish parents would be very upset if you suggest to them that they're not interested in what is best for their children. And I think it's the thing about the English system is it breeds distrust, it breeds that anxiety. It makes you think that if you're being told your duty as a responsible parent is to do all the research and look at the league tables and pick out the best school for your children, it makes you think, well, what's wrong with my local school? Clearly there's something I shouldn't be trusting them. And yes, I don't know. So I don't know if that operates at an individual level.
Of course, another way of putting that would be, people say Scottish schools, are they good enough? But that, you know, then we're going much wider. Sure. Now, I presume that there will be a number of questions, but I want to ask in case I don't get to ask another question, which is, you're quite clear that you don't think we can put choice back in the bottle for the English. I mean, we've got a very conservative government that supports it entirely. There's no debate around reducing choice. Do you think we should? Do you think we could? Very briefly.
My instinct would be that to move England back towards something more similar to Scotland would be optimal. I think that we haven't really got into this. Maybe we'll end the questions a bit. I think that there are the placing request system potentially causes issues in Scotland as well. You might think that's not ideal, and there are all sorts of underlying issues around social segregation, where you could argue that in an ideal world we wouldn't even want the level of choice that Scottish families have.
Right.
But I think that would be deeply impractical. I think that would cause a lot of frustration and disenchantment. So yeah, I don't know. One thing that struck me kind of reading and researching the PhD was New Zealand has kind of been on a bit of a journey, and it's something, if I had a bit more time, I'd love to kind of dig into a bit more. But New Zealand was, along with England and latterly Sweden, kind of one of these countries that was really at the forefront of choice, and that in quick succession through the 90s pushed forward a whole bunch of reforms to the point of fully abolishing catchment areas and being quite tough on schools in terms of the limits to their ability to set admissions criteria. And then a Labour government came to power in New Zealand in, I think, 2000, and reversed it, and the settlement has gone back to something that has less choice. So I don't know if it necessarily is a one-way ratchet. I think it needs to be communicated very clearly.
Yeah. And
so you need kind of stomach for potentially a pretty big fight. So I don't know if it's impossible. I find it hard to conceive of a government that kind of would take that hassle on, basically.
But you know, I'm just a little bit older than you by about several decades, and I do think you notice that you have political eras where what seemed impossible in one can happen, and I could imagine and would very much welcome a government, and it would presumably be a Labour government, that said, look, the choice isn't working, people aren't happy, let's do it differently, and let's actually just invest in really good schools and diversity within schools, which the Canadian system has done more of when it was challenged by the kind of free school equivalents about 10 years ago or so. So I don't think it's impossible, but I take your point, it would be impossible now. So look, Susan, can I go back to you as a chair to orchestrate the questions if we have some?
Will do. Thanks very much, Melissa and Avik. What a fascinating discussion. We have one related question that I'll just pin on the end there from Thelma Walker, if that's all right. And it's almost, could choice be put back in the bottle, which is kind of what you were just discussing. But is it a vote loser at the moment for politicians?
It's a really good question. It's really hard to know, to be honest. I think in my kind of mental model of how elections work, I suspect that most things aren't vote winners or vote losers when we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of individual policies. And essentially, what you're doing is any given policy has a risk of blowing up in your face in the way that, you know, if we look across the channel to France, there's not I don't think it's necessarily the case that raising taxes on petrol is going to cause massive protests, but that was the thing that just caught the moment. So I think this is in the realm of policies that you could sneak through, and some people, and a lot of people, there's a handful of people that we really exercise, but it probably isn't going to move an election. Or it could be if it just fits into a narrative or on the wrong news day, or is used well and effectively by the opposition, that could shift votes. Sorry, that's kind of questioning the premise of the question rather than the actual thing. But I think this is not a thing that is like obviously going to move elections.
Oh, sorry, Avi. Yeah,
on, yeah.
I was just going to say, I think one can underestimate the hostility there has been from the Second World War onwards to the idea of an all non-selective local schools in England. It is a massively contentious issue in a way that I feel, probably rightly, it is not in Scotland. And I think you would you'd get tarred with the, you know, what do you call it, dumbing down, social engineering. I mean, anybody who's campaigned on this, as I have, and many others, and some on this call, will know that it is just, it's a debate that sort of shifts slightly, but not really. So, but I did wonder, and I'd be interested to know if Thelma, who was a Labour MP who asked that question, whether she thinks it would have been possible, say, for a Labour government to bring in to guarantee a place at your local school, and then to allow an element of choice, and whether that would be a shift that might work. We've got
the power to unmute Thelma and ask her directly if she's willing. Thelma, are you able to unmute and tell us what you think?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for answering the question, Avik. I found the discussion really, really interesting. I've always been of the thought very strongly, I was on the Education Select Committee as well, that, you know, it is possible to achieve a good school in every community for every child. And I always kept back to that basic position, really. And I do think, though, that there are some politicians in some constituencies where maybe there's grammar schools, for instance, or academy chains, where, as Melissa has mentioned, to upturn the status quo would be highly unpopular. So when there are so many issues at the moment, especially post-pandemic, to then turn to this question where actually at the moment everybody seems okay with it, for a politician to upset those present structures could be highly unpopular and bring grief to them at a time when they've so much else to deal with. And I do believe even the Labour Shadow Education Secretary has recently said that she wouldn't be looking at changing the present structures. So there is a challenge ahead, but I would maintain it's the right of every child to have a good school in their own community. Thanks.
Thanks, Thelma. I do wonder if demographics might end up to changing systems, because there was a report the other day, I think it was in the FT, about how the reduction in number of children means schools will have to close, but there isn't apparently a mechanism for closing schools that are no longer under direct funding of the local government. So yeah, it could be interesting times ahead. Anyway, I will stop hogging the floor. Joanne Bartley, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi there, hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I just have a question on that awful practice where you see in estate agent websites where there's move to this area to get a highly rated school. Does that still go on in Scotland too? And does less choice make that behaviour more or less?
I can say, Avik's nodding. It's not quite in the estate agent window, but it is pretty much always on the advertisement brochure.
It is, yeah.
Really, really good, really important, really interesting question. So you might think that if you have a system where the vast majority, where almost everybody goes to their local school, that would create more pressure and more encouragement for kind of residential school choice, as it's suggesting. Actually, what I found is around about half of parents say that they chose the area they live in part because of the school. And it is somewhere in the order of 1 in 10 say that they chose the area specifically because of the school. But that is basically the same in England and Scotland. There's no difference. So you get that sort of choice in England anyway, and then you get the formal choice through the application process on top. And I should say that I talked about this school choice kind of making inequalities worse and causing segregation. It is still the vast majority of the segregation that we have between schools is because, both in England and in Scotland, is because rich and poor people don't live in the same neighbourhoods, and that is choice makes it worse, but it's not the cause of that problem. I should be absolutely clear about that.
Thanks, Avik. We have a question on home education, which I think must mean homeschooling. Are the rates similar in Scotland and England?
That is a good question. Off the top of my head, I do not know, sorry.
That's all right. I thought we'd go. And then we've got a couple of questions about faith schools. Do faith schools work the same way in Scotland as in England? Or obviously the choice isn't the same, but I know from where I live, because I have to declare it the way Melissa did at the beginning. I have a P7 who's transitioning this year, and we got sent a letter about which catchments we were in, and of those there was a faith school where they had a much wider catchment. Is that so?
Yeah, I think that's basically this. Yeah. That's basically the system. Certainly, I know that's the system in Edinburgh. I think it's the same in Glasgow as well. Okay, sorry. Yes, so I should say, so Glasgow and Edinburgh, which have got big, where faith schools kind of matter a lot more, and there's more of them. You get, you're allocated a non-denominational school and a faith school, and you kind of have the choice of those in a sense. So you get 2 catchment schools basically. In other parts of the country, so in Aberdeen, there are no faith secondary schools. In Dundee, it'll be if you're feeder, or if you're you probably be going to the feeder primary school, which is a religious school. Yeah, so cool. It's different in different places.
And then just while we're still on that, there's another question. In an increasingly secular UK, should we still allow faith schools? Not controversial at all.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I think it touches on we haven't even got into this, but there's essentially a philosophy chapter of the PhD where I'm talking about why would choice be good? What is good about choice? Under what circumstances? And one of the arguments, and we're so far away from this in the policy debate that we lose it, but I think one of the arguments is that choice feels more valuable if it is allowing us to express something authentic about ourselves, or to give expression to our deepest values. And so I think there is a form of argument under which religious schooling is maybe one of the more plausible rationales for school choice, if you accept that. And it's really awkward because actually nobody wants to talk. I don't think this is the conclusion that the people who are pushing this particularly want, but probably the strongest case for that is in the case of Muslim schools, where I think that sense of it would be really, really valuable to have our children educated in a way that's more consistent with our faith is really powerful. And I guess we're seeing this a little bit with the stuff around Trojan horse in recent weeks. Now, I think that is an argument plausibly for. There's lots of reasons why you would maybe tear down that argument or not accept it. Firstly, I think there is some value to having, well, firstly, I think there is always a problem about, are we giving voice to the authentic values of the parent or of the child? Can children be authentically Muslim or authentically Catholic in a meaningful sense? I think there's also kind of deep problems around segregation. You only need to look at Northern Ireland to see the kind of deep problems of having a school system that is segregated by religion. So I'm not, sorry, that's not an answer, but that's the considerations on both sides, basically.
Can I ask a supplementary question to Avik about that? Which is, so I'm married to a Glaswegian Catholic. So I'm curious as to whether, a bit like in Northern Ireland, religious schools or faith schools are more to do, a bit like Muslim schools in this country, to do with religion. Whereas my perception of some of the Anglican and Catholic schools in England is that they're more to do with back to social mix and ethos that parents want. So I've known an enormous number of parents that really have no religion who really wanted to go to faith schools. And I wondered and that's to do with wanting to go to what they think of as a disciplined, ambitious, well-run school that just happens to be. Does that make sense? And I just like, is that different in Scotland? Is it really more about your faith?
So unfortunately, I didn't do any of my fieldwork in Glasgow, which is where I suspect that would be most kind of pertinent. But I did speak to parents who were sending their children to faith schools, and it wasn't fundamentally different to the motivations that people in England have. And some of them will be kind of motivated by religion. Sometimes it will be, I'm not even a Catholic, or I'm not even an Anglican, but I want a church school because I think religious values are good. I think it's kind of morally better. So there's a bunch of kind of reasons that go into that. But I think I don't want to speak about Glasgow because I expect that'd be more likely to be the case in Glasgow, if it is. But elsewhere in the country, I didn't really. It didn't seem that different to England.
I'm sorry, just for the sake of action, I must say I'm married to a Glaswegian ex-Catholic. He'd kill me if I called him a Catholic. Okay, so Susan, back to you.
So we're rapidly running out of time, so we'll whiz through some questions. Ben Ockenden, can you unmute and ask your question, please? I'll just check he's still here. We'll maybe come back to Ben in a minute. Maybe he's lost his internet. Ron Glatter, are you able to ask a question?
Mute, there we are.
Thanks, Ron.
Right. Yes. Well, my question is, the other side of the Blair era rhetoric was about school diversity, not just choice. So they created specialist schools, academies, as well as faith schools were there already, and grammar schools, and other ways of promoting ever more difference between state-funded schools. Are Scottish schools much more similar to each other than schools in England, so creating less need for choice? Is there an issue, therefore, about supply as well as about demand? I believe you're an economist, so I thought I'd put it in those terms.
Yeah, really good question. Yeah, so there's a bit of a tension in some of the discussion around the rationale for choice between, do you want what economists would call a commoditized market, like the market for, I don't know, potatoes, where potatoes are all basically the same, and so all the potato farmers are competing with one another to just create kind of cheaper potatoes to do that, kind of maintain an adequate quality. And so you're all on one dimension of all the schools are competing on quality, or do you want schools to be different? And so the point of choice is not to kind of incentivize schools to compete with each other to try and attract students, but to get them to carve out little niches. But the trouble is, if you have a niche, if you are Apple, for example, then you don't need to compete on price because you've managed to attract a load of people who are not going to substitute you for another school. So it lessens the competitive pressure. And there's always, from an economics perspective, there is this a bit of a tension, and they kind of, in some ways, I think, wanted to have it both ways on that. The creators of the school market. It is true that there are lots of efforts to create a more diverse set of schools in England than in Scotland, and by and large, they probably are more different. It is hard for me to judge in practice how different that is. So for example, and on the other hand, what is frankly marketing. So the thing that Melissa said right at the start about schools change a lot, that is the impression that a lot of people have in England. And partly that's policy. You know, if your school was a local authority school that passed on to a different academy chain, you know, that sort of stuff changes quite frequently and potentially can change the character of the school quite a lot. Another thing that I found in England is there's a bit more of a kind of cult of the head teacher. So you know what the head teacher is, you know what their vibe is and what their values are and what they're kind of trying to do strategically with the school. And that seems to be a little bit less common, whereas in Scotland, there's probably a bit more focus on the fundamentals, which make the schools seem fundamentally less diverse. In Scotland, schools are all run by the local authority, and not in England. In terms of the actual kind of functional differences, in London, you get a lot of diversity. As I said, there is that complexity. There's more specialist schools. There's more like music schools and artistic schools and things like that. And probably post-academization, a bit more of a kind of quite different, more of a difference in ethos. I didn't find a huge kind of amount of demand from parents from that, frankly. And I think there probably is still a bit of a tendency among most parents to still try and flatten it into good schools and bad schools. So the short answer is yes, they are different. Yes, I think there is more diversity. I'm not sure how much of that is impressions as opposed to reality. And I'm not sure that is responding to what parents want or seek.
Okay, Melissa wants to come in quickly.
Yeah, I do. It's just that when your Guardian piece came out, somebody tweeted, I noticed, isn't choice creating and enabling an interesting plethora of choices, which allows you to choose the right school for your child? And I'm afraid my immediate, slightly mistrustful response was, well, is it really about, you know, fair difference, or is it actually another form of very subtle segregation? I mean, if you've got to, there are some schools they have a rowing specialism. I don't think you have to, you know, it's pretty clear to work out what a rowing specialism is leading you to, and it's true, it's more Oxbridge applications and so on. And the other thing which has just occurred to me in years of thinking about this, your point about the cult of the head teacher, I think it's very interesting that Tony Blair, who really had a cult of political leadership, brought in education, you could say lots of mini Tony Blairs and Antonia Blairs to run schools, because the cult of the head teacher really, really grew post New Labour. And I think that you know, people do like to create public services in their own image as well as values.
Right. We're rapidly running out of time, so I'm afraid we can't take any more questions, but I'm hoping this has given the audience of a taster of, I think, like a can of worms that you've opened, Avik, because you really showed us that actually we are talking about education today, but choice comes into so many different areas of public policy that I'm really interested in the idea of choice and market, and does it drive up standards? Does it lead to better, or does it lead to just more confusion and more difference? Because it is coming up in quite a few different policy areas now. Although I did see you tweet about a month ago, you thought it was the idea of choice was gone, and it's right back on the table there for a number of policy areas now. So we haven't got into some of the areas that I'm interested in that we've had in David Hume Institute events before. So Olli-Pekka Heinonen, when we had the old education minister over from Finland, he was really clear in Finland they don't do choice. And that was quite interesting, and as a result of an audience question. So another international example. We haven't talked about how choice results in parents driving their children to school more often, and so perhaps there's another climate impact, and social cohesion. So I was really interested in the Legatum Institute session we had last September that showed social cohesion is very different in Scotland to in England, and perhaps that is to do with schools and communities, but there wasn't any research that kind of showed how that could be, but just that there was a number of difference. Anyway, I'll hand over to both of you for what we've probably got is maybe 1 or 2 sentences of summary of the thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with. Melissa, do you want to go first?
Well, just that some of the things you've brought up. I mean, I try not to mention Finland because it is such it often comes up in education, and if you're used to debating with those who are very pro-choice, there's a bit of a groan. But I mean, I think the idea of really good local schools, of teachers who have far greater time to think and plan, I mean, basically the idea that you have less choice and more quality, I think is a really important one. And I've always wanted to see the English system go in that way. And I think Scotland is ahead of us on that. And so really my final thought is thank you, Avik, for doing this incredibly deep study, which helps us with those arguments. And I know you're not writing a polemic, but also shows us, as Susan's brought up, further areas of research and discussion that in this particular period. So if you'd like to give your concluding thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Really, I liked your thoughts there at the end, Susan, in terms of the number of different issues we could go into. And I think maybe the one thing I'd like to say, so pivoting from what Melissa said, which is, yes, Scotland can give itself a bit of a pat on the back, but hopefully not too big of one, because I think there are a lot of kind of issues beyond this. And I think complacency in Scottish policy is not a particularly attractive look. So yes, okay, choice perhaps isn't the way to improve educational standards, but what is, and what other levers should we be pulling, what other routes should we be looking at? And on the segregation point, yes, Scotland isn't making things actively worse by encouraging parents to move, but still we have segregated communities and segregated schools as a result. So for example, just within this narrow remit, one thing that Scotland could, for example, be looking at is what I call gerrymandering catchment areas. Danish local authorities do this a bit, trying to build in that balance so the default maybe isn't so comfortable for everyone. I think this point about segregation and social cohesion is absolutely critical, and I think it's something we don't talk about enough in education policy.
Brilliant. So we're 1 minute over. So I'll thank you both ever so much. A really lively discussion. And I think it's one that we'll definitely have to come back to, because there's so much more to discuss. Yes, Avik, I think totally take the challenge. We don't want to rest on our laurels in Scotland. We want Scottish education system to improve. But it looks like from your really detailed research, one of the longest PhDs I think I've heard of at 6 years, I think you said, it's definitely a brilliant PhD, and thank you for sharing it with us today. So thank you to our audience and to all the questioners and to Melissa for hosting us. Really appreciate everyone's time, and have a lovely afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much.
Susan.
Thank you.